The stars in the sky looked peaceful, but the crew of the Vanguard knew they were entering danger. Captain Soren gazed at the coordinates on the ship's display. His fingers brushed over the controls, hesitant but determined. They were on a rescue mission, or so they thought. It had started as a simple assignment. A distress signal from a nearby space station had gone quiet, and the higher-ups had ordered a team to check it out. But when they reached the station's location, they found nothing. Only a dark, silent ship floating in space. Captain Soren wasn't sure what to expect. The ship in front of them had been abandoned, or so it seemed. There were no signals, no signs of life, just cold metal and empty silence. It was a ghost ship. "Prepare for boarding," Soren's voice echoed through the comms. The crew, tense but ready, secured their helmets and made their way to the airlock. The Vanguard was a smaller vessel, built for stealth and speed, and its crew was well trained. Soren had worked with Lieutenant Zara, Engineer Clark, and Medic Harper for years. They knew how to handle any situation that came their way, or so they thought. Zara, the sharp-eyed communications officer, scanned the abandoned ship with a look of suspicion. She didn't trust the silence. Something was off. "It feels too quiet," she muttered under her breath, but no one responded. They were too focused on the task ahead. With a hiss of hydraulics, the airlock opened. The crew stepped out onto the dark, metallic floor of the abandoned ship. Their footsteps echoed through the empty halls, creating a haunting rhythm as they advanced deeper into the ship's maze-like interior. The ship was older, its technology outdated, but it still had power. The lights flickered on as they moved, casting strange shadows against the walls. The corridors seemed endless, twisting and turning with no clear direction. "This place gives me the creeps," Harper said, adjusting his medical kit. He wasn't a fighter, but his instincts told him something wasn't right. Soren nodded. He wasn't usually one to believe in superstitions or creepy feelings, but something felt wrong about this mission. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, but he brushed it off. They had a job to do. They couldn't back down now. The team moved cautiously, exploring the ship room by room. Each compartment they entered was more unsettling than the last. Abandoned equipment, overturned chairs, and strange symbols marked the walls. Nothing was normal. It looked like the crew of this ship had left in a hurry. And yet, there were no signs of what happened to them. "We need to check the command center," Soren said, his voice steady but filled with uncertainty. The crew followed his lead, heading towards the ship's control room. As they neared the entrance, the doors slid open with a hiss, revealing a dimly lit control room. The consoles flickered with life, but no one was at the helm. A chair was turned backwards, facing a window that looked out into the empty void of space. A lone chair, empty, and a cold silence that wrapped around them. "What happened here?" Zara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She stepped forward, pressing buttons on the console, trying to find any trace of what had occurred. But the ship's systems were old and failing. It was like they were too late to save anyone. A sudden, sharp noise broke the silence. It came from deep within the ship, a loud bang, followed by the sound of metal scraping against metal. The entire crew froze. There was someone, or something, still aboard. "What the hell was that?" Clark asked, his voice tense. "I don't know," Soren replied, his hand on his weapon. "Stay alert. We're not alone." The crew moved quietly, their eyes darting to every corner, their weapons ready. Each step they took felt heavier, the weight of their surroundings pressing down on them. The silence that had once been so eerie now felt suffocating. The ship seemed alive, watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. Suddenly, the lights went out. Darkness enveloped them, and for a moment, the only sound was the pounding of their hearts. Then, without warning, the emergency lights flashed on, casting an eerie red glow across the room. "Something's not right," Zara said, her voice shaking. She was trying to maintain her composure, but even she couldn't hide the fear in her voice. Then the door to the command center slammed shut, trapping them inside. "Get to the hatch," Soren ordered, but the ship's system had already locked down. They were stuck. The emergency lights flickered, casting shadows on the walls, and the eerie hum of the ship grew louder. They could hear something moving in the darkness, something large, something that didn't belong. A voice crackled over the intercom. It was distorted, but the message was clear. "You shouldn't have come." The crew froze, realizing they had walked right into a trap. The lights flickered again, casting the crew in a cold, unsettling red glow. The metal walls creaked, and the hum of the ship grew louder, like a living organism slowly waking from a long slumber. The crew stood frozen in the dim command center, their weapons drawn and hearts pounding in their chests. Something was wrong, horribly wrong. Captain Soren's hand clenched around his weapon, his eyes scanning the shadows beyond the emergency lights. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, as if the ship itself were watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. "What the hell was that?" Zara asked, her voice trembling as she backed toward the wall, looking around nervously. Her pulse raced in her throat, but her training kicked in. "Stay calm. We need to get out of here." Soren nodded sharply, his mind racing. He knew they had to act quickly before they were trapped for good. But just as he was about to order a retreat to the shuttle, the ship's system responded. The airlock on the far side of the room slammed shut with a loud bang, cutting off their escape route. "Damn it," Soren cursed, slamming his fist against the console. "We're locked in. The ship sealed us in." "Is it the same system that locked the door?" Clark asked, his eyes darting around as if looking for something. Anything that could explain this madness. Zara's fingers flew over the controls. "I can't override the lock. This system is ancient, but somehow it's still functional. Almost too functional." Suddenly, the intercom crackled again, a distorted voice filled with static, but it was unmistakable. The voice was cold, hollow, as though it came from deep within the ship's core. "You shouldn't have come." The voice echoed through their earpieces, chilling them to the bone. The message was short but unmistakably clear. They were not welcome here. Someone, or something, was playing a deadly game with them. "What the hell is that?" Clark whispered, his hand trembling on the control panel. "There's no one here. We scanned the entire ship. I don't think we're dealing with a someone," Soren said, his voice low and grim. "We're dealing with something much worse. This ship, it's not just abandoned. It's alive." The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway outside the command room, slow and deliberate. There was no mistaking it. Someone, or something, was moving through the ship. "I'll check it out," Zara said, her voice steady despite the fear rising in her chest. She moved cautiously toward the door, but as her hand touched the control panel, a loud bang came from the far side of the room. The crew spun around, guns raised, but there was nothing, just the eerie hum of the ship's malfunctioning lights. "We're not alone," Soren said, his voice tight with anxiety. His eyes darted from corner to corner, looking for any sign of movement. Suddenly, a strange grinding noise echoed from the floor beneath their feet. The ship's walls seemed to shake as the very structure of the ship creaked and groaned. "What the hell is happening?" Harper shouted, his voice rising in panic. His grip on his medical kit tightened, and he stepped back from the wall, as if expecting something to burst out. Before anyone could respond, a low growl rumbled through the air. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything they had ever heard before. "I think we're about to find out," Zara said, her voice barely a whisper. She turned toward the hallway, and then back to Soren, her face pale with fear. "Captain, I think it's already here." The growl grew louder, more distinct. It was followed by the sound of claws scraping against metal, the unmistakable sound of something huge moving through the ship's ventilation system. Soren's heart raced. "Get to the shuttle. Now," he barked. He couldn't let his crew face whatever was lurking in the ship's dark corners. They had to escape, but it was too late. The ventilation grates above them began to rattle. There was something inside them, something large and hungry. The crew's weapons were drawn, but Soren knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever this creature was, it wasn't afraid of guns. Then the ship's intercom crackled again, and the cold voice returned. "It's too late. You're already mine." A piercing shriek rang out from somewhere deep within the ship, followed by the sound of something monstrous crawling through the vents. The sound was enough to paralyze anyone with fear. The silence that followed the creature's shriek was suffocating. It wasn't the kind of silence you could get used to. It was a tense, waiting silence. The sound of the ship groaning under some unseen force, the hum of its systems, and the sound of their breathing were the only things filling the air. Captain Soren's mind raced. His fingers tightened around his weapon, but even as he scanned the shadows of the command center, he knew this wasn't a fight he could win with brute force. The ship's walls seemed to close in on them, each sound amplifying the growing sense of dread. Zura was the first to break the silence. Her voice trembled, but it was still sharp. What was that thing? Soren didn't have an answer. He'd faced enemies before. Hostile forces, dangerous alien creatures, and even the occasional rogue AI. But nothing like this. Nothing had ever felt so alive. It wasn't just the ship that felt strange. It was the air. The weight. The feeling of being watched, like there was something hidden in every corner, every shadow. "I don't know," Soren said quietly, his voice low but steady. "But we need to find out what's going on here. And fast. We don't know what it is or what it wants, but we can't stay in this room. It's too exposed." Zara nodded, her gaze darting nervously to the door. Clark was looking around, tapping the edge of his weapon against the floor, clearly on edge. "There's got to be a way out of here. Some sort of escape hatch or something." Soren turned and looked at the console. The ship's systems were a mess. The controls flickered, and nothing seemed to work right. The whole ship felt like it was malfunctioning, and that made Soren's gut tighten. Whatever was behind this, it wasn't random. The malfunctioning systems weren't just the result of an old ship. This felt intentional. "We need to move. Head to the secondary escape pods," Soren ordered, his voice firm. "We'll have to find another way to get out of here." But as soon as the words left his mouth, another loud bang echoed from somewhere deep within the ship. The sound was followed by more growls. Closer this time, almost like something was prowling just beyond the door. "Something's coming," Clark muttered, his face pale. "We've got no choice. We're not going to outrun it," Soren said. "We need to find the source. We need to end this before it's too late." The crew moved quickly, but with caution, towards the hallway. The emergency lights cast an eerie red glow, but they could still make out the dark, shadowed corners. Their footsteps echoed, but the growls from behind them grew louder and more intense. They made their way through the dimly lit ship, the air growing colder and thicker. It felt like the ship itself was alive, aware of their every step. Then they came to a large door, far down the hallway, its surface covered in strange markings. "This is it," Soren said, his voice low and tense. "I think this is where it all started." The door opened with a slow hiss, revealing a room filled with strange machinery. The machines were old, but they were still active, glowing with a dim green light. Strange symbols covered the walls, symbols that looked almost alien. There was a chill in the air, and the room felt like a tomb. But it wasn't empty. In the center of the room, a large, twisted figure stood motionless. It was humanoid in shape, but not human. Its body was covered in a thick, metallic exoskeleton, and its eyes glowed an eerie yellow. It was massive, towering over the crew. The creature didn't move, but the moment they entered the room, it knew they were there. Soren's heart hammered in his chest. "What the hell is that?" "That's not just any alien," Clark whispered, his voice quivering. That's what's been controlling the ship." The creature's eyes slowly moved, locking onto them. It tilted its head, almost as if studying them. The room felt heavier, the air thick with an almost suffocating presence. Then, a voice, deep and rasping, echoed in their minds. It was not a voice from a speaker or a radio. It was something much more unnatural, something they could feel inside their own minds. "Foolish humans," the voice boomed. "You think you've come to rescue, but you are only the next sacrifice." Soren's blood ran cold. "What do you want from us?" The creature's lips twisted into a grotesque smile, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. "You are not the first to fall into my trap, and you will not be the last." Soren's mind raced. This was no ordinary alien. This creature was not just a predator. It was a predator with a purpose. It had been waiting for the right moment, manipulating the ship, sending out false distress signals to lure them in. And now, they were caught in its web. "We need to stop it," Soren said, his voice sharp with determination. But the creature wasn't finished. It raised its clawed hand, and the machinery around them hummed to life. The walls groaned again as the ship began to shift, the room moving as if it was a part of the creature's very body. The floor trembled beneath them. "You are mine," the creature said, its voice reverberating in their skulls. "And you will never leave." The walls of the room shifted again, groaning under the weight of some unseen force. The crew stood frozen, their weapons raised, but the creature before them made no move to attack. Instead, it simply watched, its glowing yellow eyes piercing through them like they were nothing more than insects under a microscope. "We're not going to make it out of here," Clark muttered, his voice tinged with fear. He wasn't wrong. The room felt like it was closing in, and the creature seemed to be drawing power from the very ship itself. The low hum of the ship's core was growing louder, more insistent, as though it too was alive. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as the walls around them seemed to pulse in rhythm with the creature's movements. "Stay focused," Soren ordered, his voice low but commanding. "We can't let it break our resolve. We need to find its weakness. Whatever it is, it's not invincible." Zora's eyes were scanning the room, trying to make sense of the alien machinery that surrounded them. There were tubes and wires snaking along the walls, pulsating with the same eerie green glow as the creature. "The ship is connected to it," she said softly, more to herself than anyone else. "It's like the ship is part of it. If we destroy the core, we might have a chance." Soren's eyes narrowed as he studied the creature. The being didn't flinch, didn't seem threatened by their weapons or their words. It stood still, watching them, waiting. "Then let's go for the core," he said. "We destroy it. We destroy the creature." But just as they started to move toward the door, the creature's voice echoed in their minds again, even louder this time. "You cannot defeat me, human. I have lived for centuries. This ship is mine. All who enter it become mine." The sound of its voice made their heads throb, as if the very words were ripping through their thoughts, trying to break them. Soren gritted his teeth and pushed the pain aside. They had no choice. They had to act now. "Move," Soren shouted. He led the crew toward the corridor that stretched out before them, the narrow passageway lit only by the pale emergency lights. Behind them, the creature made no move, but the eerie pressure in the air increased, the ship's hum becoming a growl as if it, too, was waking from a long slumber. They reached the central hall, a massive space filled with more alien machinery. The ship's core loomed at the far end, a massive sphere suspended in a complex web of tubes, wires, and what appeared to be some sort of alien technology. The creature's presence seemed to radiate from the core, as though it was tethered to it, drawing energy and life from it. "We need to shut this thing down," Zora said, her voice urgent as she ran her hands over the controls near the core. "If I can get to the main control system, we might have a chance to overload it." "But how long will it take?" Soren asked, his eyes scanning the dark corridors behind them. He could feel the presence of the creature growing stronger, feel its eyes boring into him from the shadows. "Not long," Zora replied. though her voice wavered with uncertainty. "But we have to make sure it's fully disconnected. If we don't—" The creature's growl interrupted her. The air seemed to vibrate with a low hum, and then, without warning, the entire hallway lit up in a blinding flash of green. The core glowed brighter, and the ship's walls buckled and cracked, as if the ship was responding to the creature's anger. "It's awake," Clark gasped, his eyes wide with terror. The creature appeared before them in an instant, emerging from the shadows like a wraith. Its massive, clawed hands stretched out toward them, its eyes gleaming with malice. "You will never leave this place." It was fast, faster than they could react. The air around them seemed to warp, and before they could even raise their weapons, the creature was upon them, its claws slashing through the air. Soren's heart raced as he dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the creature's claws. "Zara," he shouted, "hurry up with that system." Zara was already at the control panel, her fingers moving quickly across the keys. Sweat poured down her face as she tried to access the ship's core system. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, and the creature was getting closer with every step. The creature snarled, moving toward her, but Clark threw himself in its path, firing his weapon with all the force he could muster. The shots didn't seem to faze it, but it slowed its advance for just a moment. That was enough. "Almost there," Zara muttered, her voice strained as she typed in a sequence of commands. "Just a few more seconds." The creature howled in frustration, swinging its claws down toward Zora. But Soren moved quickly, firing his weapon and aiming for the creature's weak points, its eyes, its joints, anything that might slow it down. "Now," Zora shouted. With a final press of a button, the ship's core roared to life. A surge of power coursed through the room, and the entire ship seemed to shake. The lights flickered, and the machinery hummed, as if it were struggling against the overwhelming force. For a moment, the creature paused, its body writhing as if it was being pulled in different directions. The lights blinked, the ship shuddered, and the creature let out a final, agonizing scream. Then, with a deafening roar, the core erupted. The ship's walls trembled as the core exploded, its energy swirling in a chaotic burst of light and power. For a moment, everything was silent. The air was thick with the sound of dying machinery, and the entire vessel seemed to groan in pain, as though it too was mourning its fate. Soren's heart raced as he stared at the creature, which was still reeling from the shockwave of the core's destruction. It staggered, its massive body writhing in agony, its claws reaching out as if it were grasping for something to hold on to. But there was nothing. The ship was falling apart around them, and the creature was slowly losing its grip on its power. "We've done it," Clark shouted, his voice filled with hope. "It's weakening." But Soren knew better. The creature was powerful, and even with the core destroyed, they couldn't be sure it was done. Its eyes, now a dull yellow, flickered with rage and desperation. It was still alive, still hungry, and it wasn't ready to die yet. "We need to get out of here, now," Soren ordered, grabbing Zora's arm and pulling her toward the exit. The walls groaned again, and the ship seemed to collapse in on itself. The emergency lights flickered, casting long shadows down the narrow corridors. Zara stumbled, her mind still spinning from the earlier chaos. "We can't just leave. It's still here. We need to make sure it's dead." "We don't have time," Soren barked, pulling her along. "The ship's collapsing. We need to survive. We'll deal with it later." The crew moved quickly, their footsteps echoing down the hallways. They had no idea how much time they had before the ship completely broke apart, but every second counted. The ship was a labyrinth of corridors and rooms, but they knew where they needed to go. The escape pods were just a few levels down, and if they could make it, they might have a chance at survival. But as they turned a corner, they found themselves face to face with the creature once again. It stood at the end of the hallway, its massive form blocking their only way forward. Its glowing eyes had returned to their full, fiery intensity, and it was angrier than ever. "You think you can escape?" it growled, its voice sending chills down their spines. "You are trapped, just like all the others before you." Soren's mind raced. There was no way they could fight the creature now. Their weapons were useless. The creature had grown too powerful, too connected to the ship, and the escape pods were just beyond the creature's reach. He turned to his crew, their faces grim, their expressions filled with fear. They had nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. But Soren wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. He scanned the hallway for anything they could use to fight back. Zara's voice cut through the air, urgent and desperate. "The ship's main reactor, it's still functioning, but it's unstable. If we can overload it, we might take this thing down with us." Soren's eyes snapped to her. "You're sure?" "There's no time to doubt it," she replied, her voice steady despite the panic in her eyes. "We overload the reactor, and this whole ship will implode. If we're lucky, we'll take the creature down with us." "Then let's do it," Soren said without hesitation. "Clark, cover us." Clark nodded, his weapon raised as he aimed at the creature. The creature let out an animalistic growl, its massive claws flexing as it advanced toward them, its yellow eyes burning with hunger. Soren and Zara ran toward the reactor control panel, their feet pounding against the floor. They could hear the creature's footsteps behind them, growing louder with every second. Clark fired a round into the creature's chest, but it did little more than make the creature pause for a split second. "We're almost there," Zara shouted, her fingers flying over the console. "I just need a few more seconds." But the creature wasn't about to let them finish. With a roar, it lunged toward them, its claws slashing through the air with terrifying speed. The explosion rocked the ship like a massive quake, its force sending shockwaves through the crumbling structure. The walls cracked and shattered as the entire vessel seemed to groan in pain. Blinding light filled every crevice of the ship, and then, as quickly as it began, the blast was gone. Silence hung heavy in the air. Zara's heart pounded in her chest as she stumbled into the escape pod. Her hands shook as she strapped herself into the seat, her eyes wild with panic. The ship around her was falling apart. She could feel the heat of the explosion searing through the hull as the last remnants of the creature's power were torn apart. Her breathing was ragged, and her mind raced. Was Soren still alive? The question gnawed at her. He had told them to go, to escape. But could he really have sacrificed himself for them? Was he dead, or had he somehow survived the blast? She didn't have the answers, and she couldn't stop herself from feeling the weight of uncertainty. Clark was at the controls, his fingers moving quickly as he prepared the pod for launch. He didn't look back at her. His face was a mask of concentration, but Zara could see the strain in his shoulders, the tension in his every movement. "Clark." "Soren," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He glanced at her, his face pale. "We have to go, Zara. We can't wait for him." She nodded, her throat tight. She didn't want to leave him behind. She didn't want to think that Soren was gone. But deep down, she knew the truth. The ship had been torn apart. The explosion had been massive. There was no way he could have survived. Still, the thought of leaving him there, in the darkness, with nothing but the wreckage of the ship and the memories of their struggle, it tore at her. Zara turned her gaze to the viewport. The stars outside were still beautiful, distant, cold. But even they felt like a cruel reminder of everything they had lost. They had come to this ship, thinking it was just another job, another assignment, but they had gotten far more than they bargained for. "Zara." Clark's voice broke through her thoughts, filled with urgency. "We have to go now." Her fingers clenched around the seat, and she nodded again. She couldn't stay here forever. They had to escape, to survive. They had to leave this place behind. With one final look at the ship's deteriorating hull, Clark punched the launch button. The escape pod shot into the vast expanse of space, leaving the shattered remnants of the ship behind. The small vessel jerked forward as it disengaged from the wreckage, and Zara was thrown back into her seat. The feeling of weightlessness made her stomach lurch. She closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. But it was impossible. The ship that had once seemed like a mere challenge to conquer was now a haunting memory. She could feel the loss weighing down on her chest, and the silence around her seemed to press in from all sides. "Clark," Zora said softly, barely able to speak through the knot in her throat. "What now?" Clark didn't answer at first. He just kept his eyes locked on the controls, his hands moving deftly to adjust their course. After a long silence, he finally spoke, his voice low and filled with emotion. "We survive," he said simply. But Zara knew it was more than that. They hadn't just survived. They had endured. They had fought against a creature beyond their understanding and defied the odds. But they had also lost something. Something precious. Soren, the heart of their crew. The one who had led them, who had pushed them to keep fighting, even when everything seemed lost. And now he was gone. Forever. As they drifted through the cold expanse of space, Zora couldn't help but wonder what had become of the creature. Had the destruction of the core truly killed it? Or had they only sealed their fates further? She glanced out the viewport again, looking for any sign of what remained of the ship, of the creature. But the stars remained distant and cold. The darkness of space stretched on, endless and unforgiving. Then a flicker of light caught her eye. At first, it seemed like nothing, just a distant star. But then the light grew brighter, more erratic. It flickered and danced, as if it were alive. Zara's breath caught in her throat. The light wasn't a star. It was something else. Something new. "Clark," she whispered. "What's that?" Clark glanced up at the viewport, his eyes narrowing. His fingers hovered over the controls, unsure. "I'm not sure. It doesn't look like any ship I've ever seen." The light was growing closer now, faster, its erratic pulses growing in intensity. Whatever it wasn't a natural phenomenon. It was alive. And it was coming for them. "What do we do?" Zara asked, her voice shaking. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her again, a sense of dread washing over her. They had survived the ship's nightmare. But now, what was this? What was hunting them? Before Clark could respond, the pod jolted suddenly, throwing them both against their seats. The viewport cracked, and the strange light filled the cabin, blinding them for a brief moment. And then a voice. It was familiar, but not. It echoed in their minds, distorted, inhuman. "You think you can escape me, humans?" The voice hissed. "This ship is only the beginning. You will never be free." The sound sent waves of terror crashing through Zora's body, and she stared wide-eyed at Clark. "What? What is it?" she gasped. Clark's knuckles turned white as he gripped the controls. "I don't know, but we're not out of this yet." Zara's heart hammered in her chest as the strange, disembodied voice echoed through the escape pod. It reverberated in her mind, its sinister tone sinking deep into her bones. Clark's fingers moved rapidly over the controls, but no matter what he did, the strange light from outside only grew brighter, more intense, until it felt like the very air around them was charged with electric energy. "It's not stopping," Clark muttered, his voice strained. His gaze flicked to the viewport, and for a brief moment, Zara saw the fear in his eyes. "We can't outrun it. It's too fast." The pulsing light outside was not just some distant star. It wasn't a natural phenomenon, and it wasn't a ship. It was something alive, something that had followed them from the wreckage of the ship. Something dark and powerful, and it was getting closer. The pod shuddered again, and a strange mechanical whine filled the air, as if the ship's systems were fighting against the pull of the force outside. "What do we do?" Zara's voice trembled as she gripped the edge of her seat, staring at the viewport, desperate for an answer that didn't seem to come. Clark didn't respond right away. He kept his eyes fixed on the controls, trying desperately to keep the pod steady. The eerie light began to flicker, growing more erratic with each passing moment. Zara could feel it in her gut. Something was wrong. This wasn't just a force of nature. This was intentional, and it was coming for them. "We can't just keep running," Clark said, his voice low and steady, but Zara could hear the strain. "Whatever this thing is, it knows we're here. It's hunting us." Zara glanced over at him, her thoughts racing. "So what do? We have no weapons, no backup. We're sitting ducks in this pod." Clark's face tightened with determination. "We use what we have. The pod's weapons are small, but if we can get close enough to that thing, maybe we can blind it long enough to escape." Zara nodded quickly, though she didn't fully understand. Blind it? With what? They had no idea what they were facing. The thing outside could be a weapon, a monster, or something else entirely. But she had no choice but to trust Clark. They didn't have time to question their chances of survival. They had to act. Clark's fingers moved swiftly, adjusting the pod's trajectory. The light from outside seemed to pulse again, brighter, more threatening than ever before. The pod began to shake as it adjusted course, and Zara had to hold on tightly to avoid being thrown against the walls. "I'm going to try and get closer," Clark said through gritted teeth, his eyes never leaving the controls. "Stay alert. If we can get in range, we'll fire everything we've got." Zara's heart raced in her chest, but she didn't argue. She had to trust him. If this was their only shot, she wasn't about to waste it. Outside, the light grew blinding, and Zara could feel the presence of the entity pushing against them. The ship's systems were struggling to maintain stability, and every bump and jolt only made it more real. The creature, whatever it was, had reached them, and it wasn't going to stop until it had them. Clark's hand shot to the weapons console, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "Ready?" he asked, his voice steady despite the desperation of the situation. Zara swallowed hard, nodding. "Ready." The pod lurched forward with a sudden burst of speed, the systems screaming in protest as they closed the distance between themselves and the pulsating light outside. The eerie glow from the entity flickered and intensified, and Zara's stomach twisted in fear. It was as though the entity was reaching out to them, pulling them closer. The closer they got, the more unnatural the sensation became. Then, without warning, the entity reacted. A pulse of energy shot out from the light, slamming into the pod with a deafening crack. The pod's systems screeched, and the entire craft was sent spinning through space. Zara screamed, her body thrown against the restraints. The lights flickered, and the control panel sparked as the pod drifted uncontrollably. "We're losing power," Clark shouted, his voice full of panic as the pod spun in zero gravity. He was fighting with the controls, trying to right the ship, but it was no use. The force outside was too strong. Zara's thoughts raced as she tried to orient herself in the spinning pod. "Clark, we can't just float here. Do something." But Clark was already thinking ahead. His hands moved faster now, feverishly working on the weapon systems. "The only option we have left is to fire now, before it comes any closer." The entity's light pulsed again, its energy growing stronger by the second. Zara could feel it in her bones. Whatever it was close, closer than it had ever been. She had no idea what it could do, but she knew it was dangerous, very dangerous. They had no more time to waste. Clark set his jaw. "This is it. If we survive this, it's because of this shot." With one final, desperate push, Clark launched the pod's weapons systems at full power, sending a concentrated blast of energy directly at the entity. The beam of light shot out from the pod, streaking toward the force that had been chasing them. For a brief moment, time seemed to slow. The energy blast collided with a pulsating glow, and the two forces clashed violently, sending out shockwaves of energy that rippled through space. For a split second, there was silence. The light flickered, dimmed, and then exploded outward in a burst of energy that seemed to tear apart the very fabric of space around them. Zara held her breath. Her fingers gripped tightly to the seat. Did it work? The light outside faded, dimming to a dull glow. The overwhelming pressure they'd felt moments before was gone. They were no longer being pulled, no longer chased. The strange energy had dissipated. Clark let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He checked the systems, his fingers flying across the console. It worked. It's gone. Zora couldn't help the tears that welled up in her eyes. They had done it. They had survived. But the feeling of loss still lingered in her chest, heavy and unrelenting. Soren was gone, and nothing would ever bring him back. The creature, the ship, and the nightmares, they were all behind them. But the scars they left would never fade. "We're alive," Zora whispered, more to herself than to Clark. But at what cost? Clark didn't answer right away. He simply nodded, his expression grim. "We keep moving forward," he said quietly. "That's all we can do." As the escape pod drifted toward the nearest safe zone, Zora looked out the viewport once more. The stars were distant, cold, and endless, but they were still out there, alive, surviving, and continuing the fight. The unknown was vast, and so were their challenges. But they were stronger now, together, and they would face whatever came next.